Today, President Obama announced from the White House briefing room that he has ordered all 39,000 U.S. troops remaining in Iraq to return home by the end of this year. The president framed his announcement as fulfilling a promise he made as a candidate for president.
As a candidate for president, I pledge to bring the war in Iraq to a responsible end. So, today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over. Across America, our servicemen and women will be reunited with their families. Today, I can say that our troops in Iraq will definitely be home for the holidays.
President Obama's announcement today comes, as he indicated, nearly 9 years after President George W. Bush announced the invasion of Iraq.
The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities. Now that conflict has come, the only way to limit its duration is to apply decisive force. And I assure you, this will not be a campaign of half measures, and we will accept no outcome but victory.
The Iraq War has cost the United States over $700 billion, about the same as 10 years of the Vietnam War in current 2011 dollars. More than 1 million Americans have served in Iraq since the war began in 2003. The war has left 4,482 of those Americans dead, 32,213 wounded, and 1,146 left as amputees. There is no accurate official count of how many Iraqis have been killed or wounded in this war, but we do know that they suffered much more than we did, with more than 100,000 casualties. Republicans have been predictably critical of President Obama's withdrawal plan, most of them oblivious to the fact that it is actually the withdrawal plan put in place by President Bush.
Whether or not it's the right thing to do, I would consult with the commanders. The thing that I wouldn't do that the president is doing is telling the enemy how many troops you're going to bring out and when you're going to bring them out. I don't think that's a good strategy. I believe that I was time that was worth it, but I would not have announced this big drawdown, tell the enemy, so now they're going to basically position themselves.
Mitt Romney did not rush to the microphones on this one. He simply released a written statement. President Obama's astonishing failure to secure an orderly transition in Iraq has unnecessarily put at risk the victories that were won through the blood and sacrifice of thousands of American men and women. The unavoidable question is whether this decision is the result of a naked political calculation or simply sheer ineptitude in negotiations with the Iraqi government. The American people deserve to hear the recommendations that were made by our military. Rick Perry wisely avoided speaking about Iraq or taking questions and followed the Romney example of releasing a written statement. I'm deeply concerned that President Obama is putting political expediency ahead of sound military and security judgment by announcing an end to troop-level negotiations and a withdrawal from Iraq by year's end. The president was slow to engage the Iraqis, and there's little evidence today's decision is based on advice from military commanders. Senator John McCain, the last Republican nominee for president who has never had a plan for ending the war in Iraq, also released a written statement. I respectfully disagree with the president. This decision will be viewed as a strategic victory for our enemies in the Middle East, especially the Iranian regime, which has worked relentlessly to ensure a full withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq. I am confident that no U.S. commander of any stature who has served in Iraq recommended the course of action that has now been taken. Joining me now, Rachel Maddow, the host of The Rachel Maddow Show here on MSNBC. Also, Andrea Mitchell, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent and host of MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports. Thank you both for joining me tonight.
Hey, Lawrence, thank you.
My pleasure.
You've both been to Iraq. You are our senior advisors here at MSNBC on this subject. Rachel, your reaction to today's events and how quickly it became political.
Lawrence, I think you're absolutely right to point out that this was the withdrawal agreement that was agreed to by George W. Bush. It was a non-controversy that I didn't quite understand at the time, at the very end of the Bush-Cheney administration, that they negotiated this deal with the Iraqi government in a way that the Iraqi government had to take it to its parliament. But the American legislature, the American Congress, was never consulted. This was just signed unilaterally by George W. Bush. This was the deal, that we would have to be out by 2011. President Obama certainly could have sought changes in that deal, but to go along with ending it on the George W. Bush timeline, at this point, I think feels like the right way for President Obama to have made good on his promise as a candidate and the early promises that he made as a president about what he was going to do here. And it also, I think, calls the Republicans out in terms of whether or not they support policies on the basis of who they think they can attribute them to, or whether they support policies on the basis of their merits. If they were so bothered by this, they probably should have complained when George W. Bush signed it.
Andrea, what is the news today? In a certain sense, the president simply stood up and said, you know that thing President Bush said we were going to do and that I always said we should do? We're doing it. I mean, that's kind of what happened today, isn't it?
You know, the strange thing is, this is in the term of art, believe it or not, is called a SOFA. Yes, a status of forces agreement. It was agreed to, as Rachel has just pointed out, as you've reported, by George W. Bush and the Iraqi government. And if you believe that the whole point of this exercise was to have elections, to have an independent Iraq led by a reliable, credible, authoritative government, you have to give them the ability to be a government. And this is what they want. And if that's the case, and if they're not going to give immunity to our soldiers, legal protection, we need to leave. And we need to leave when we said we were going to leave. And that was the commitment of the prior administration.
Rachel, you know we're in the thick of a presidential campaign when the president makes a foreign policy and military announcement like this today, and then his re-election campaign office has to issue a reply to Mitt Romney. I want to read you the Obama campaign's reply to Mitt Romney's statement. Mitt Romney didn't lay out a plan to end the war in Iraq, his foreign policy agenda. He barely even mentioned Iraq, but he is apparently willing to leave American troops there without identifying a new mission. Mitt Romney's foreign policy experience is limited to his work as a finance executive shipping American jobs overseas. Rachel, that's not a preview of what's going to happen in the presidential campaign. That is what's happening in the presidential campaign.
The presidential contenders on the Republican side collectively have no foreign policy experience at all, other than John Huntsman's experience, both in business and working for Barack Obama as this nation's ambassador to China. So foreign policy is not a strong suit of the Republican candidates, and I think it'll be really interesting to watch if they try to carry on a foreign policy critique into their further discussions with one another about who's going to be the Republican nominee. They have avoided it like the plague, avoiding even the 10-year anniversary of the Afghanistan war, avoiding this, I think, the issue of Iraq today until they were absolutely forced to do it. You're right to point out that it was a written statement from Romney and a written statement from Perry. I think both of them will seek to avoid taking questions on this issue because this is not their wheelhouse. This is not their strong suit. And it has, it is a reminder to see that statement from the Obama campaign, what an emotional part of the Democratic nominating process in 2008 it was to be talking about the error that was the Iraq war. This is a big part of why we got a Democratic Congress in 2006 and why we got a Democratic Congress in a president and Congress in 2008, because the country was so against this war. It's still a very emotional issue for Democrats, and I think for most Americans, even as the Republicans mostly want to avoid it.
There's one Republican candidate for president who's never afraid of the microphone, Ron Paul. We're going to listen to what he had to say. This is not in direct response to the president's announcement about Iraq. It was more a matter of him responding to the events in Libya yesterday. Let's listen to Ron Paul.
He, of course, has been able to come up with this idea that the more dictators he kills and brags about, the more he undermines the Republicans. You know, they think that's a Republican issue. He's trying to out-Republican issue, and I find that rather disgusting.
Andrea, I just wish we had a Republican foreign policy debate, foreign policy only, coming up next week to see how they would all assemble themselves around the news of this week, from Libya to Iraq. Where do you think the Republican presidential candidates will be going as the campaign progresses in these subjects?
Well, you've had both Romney and Huntsman making speeches on the subject, and frankly, they didn't answer all of the questions that people have because they were in conflict. At least Romney's statements have been in conflict, somewhat ambiguous, from his debate answers on the withdrawal pace, where he suggested that the president's withdrawal pace would be too precipitous, but then criticized him for not listening to the generals, and based on I don't know what evidence, also saying that we should be ending the war and focusing on home. So there have been differing statements from the various Republicans along the way. I think one of the things that Rachel was pointing out was that Barack Obama became the nominee of the Democratic Party precisely because, as a senator in 2002, he opposed a war that Hillary Clinton voted for. And if that had not happened, he might not have trounced her in Iowa. And that then led to, yes, he fell behind in New Hampshire, but it set in motion the possibility of him then achieving the nomination. So his whole stance on Iraq was exactly the right stance for the Democratic nomination process. And it now, I think, is even more so where the country is because of where independents and even many Republicans are, given our economic crisis here at home. So I think that the Republicans are going to regret, I think, some of these statements down the road when they get into the general election, depending on who the nominee is.
I want to draw on both of your experiences in Iraq to respond to Lindsey Graham, who's not a presidential candidate, but he did release a written statement today about this, saying, I respectfully disagree with President Obama. I feel all we have worked for, fought for, and sacrificed for is very much in jeopardy by today's announcement. I hope I am wrong, and the president is right. But I fear this decision has set in motion events that will come back to haunt our country. Rachel, what do you think Iraq is going to look like next year after the American troops are gone?
I think Iraq next year is likely to look a lot like what it looks like right now, which is a moderately stable country with a lot of internal trouble and with a lot of pressure from Iran. I think that was set in motion when we toppled Saddam, who was the great counterweight to Iran for all of the other awful things that he was. And I think that Iraq is going to be a country that doesn't really know much what to do with its Kurdish north, that doesn't really know what to do with the Iranian allegiance, a lot of the Shiites in the south, and that has a Sunni minority that is both used to being in power and very unsure of itself with regard to its sectarian neighbors in its own country. That's what's been the truth of Iraq since we toppled Saddam. And without replacing Saddam with another warlord-type strongman, that was always going to be Iraq's future. I don't know what Lindsey Graham thinks that having 3,000 American trainers in Iraq would change about that. I don't know what having a longer war in Iraq would change about that future. When we decided to change Iraq's leadership for them, we set in motion Iraq's future. And that's been true ever since we toppled Saddam, which we did very, very early on in 2003, extending this war into year 10, year 11, year 12, year 13. It's one thing to talk about what that would cost us in terms of what we can't do in America because we're doing that, and what it would do to the military that we're asking to do that much more. It's another thing to, I think, try to think pretty clearly about whether or not that would really make a difference in Iraq's future. I think it's preposterous to think that it would.
Andrea, what do you think Iraq is going to look like next year? And, Andrea, when are you going back?
I don't know when I'm going back. I'd like to go back soon, as a matter of fact. But I want to point out that we have 7,000 to 8,000 people now at that embassy, the giant embassy, the biggest embassy that America has anywhere in the world. It looks like a prison, frankly, a fortress. And of those, 1,700 are foreign service officers. The rest are contractors. They're going to be something upwards of 30,000 American contractors, many of them with diplomatic immunity because they are attached to the embassy, a lot of intelligence officials as well. We're going to be helping them with future military sales, including, we are told today, possibly F-16 F-16s to rebuild the Air Force that we destroyed back in 2003 during that shock and awe, which, of course, was the term for the initial days of the war when we eliminated their entire Air Force. So we're going to be spending a lot of money there as well and helping them. But I fear that one of the problems is the pressure from Iran. You had Muqtada al-Sadr, the Iranian proxy, who really was the key element in blocking the extension of this in the parliament and his forces. And you've got Kurdish terrorists in the north who are pursuing terror against Turkey. There are a lot of sectional problems, and our colleague Richard Engel fears there could be civil war.
Rachel Maddow and Andrea Mitchell, the last words, senior advisors on Iraq. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks, Lawrence.